The moment you need someone to approve of your decision, you've already lost. Not later, not eventually. Right then. Because approval seeking is not a personality quirk. It's not shyness. It's not being a good listener. It is the single most reliable signal that you have handed your power to another human being. And they didn't even ask for it. Machiavelli wrote about this 500 years ago, not as theory, as observation. He watched princes crumble. He watched capable men destroyed, not by enemies, not by war, but by their own desperate need to be validated. And here's what nobody tells you. The men around you can smell it. This video is going to be uncomfortable. If you came here for motivation, for someone to tell you that you're doing great and just need a little push, leave now. There are 1,000 channels for that. This is not that. What you're about to hear is a surgical breakdown of why your need for approval is costing you. Your relationships, your career, your self-respect, and your ability to lead anything, including your own life. We're going to use Machiavelli, not the cartoon villain version the internet sells you, but the real Machiavelli, the political scientist, the man who advised rulers during one of the most brutal eras in human history, the man who understood human nature so completely that his observations are more accurate today than when he wrote them. Here are the 5 points we're going to cover. 1. Why approval seeking is not weakness, it's surrender. 2. How the need to be liked destroys your ability to lead, including yourself. 3. Why being feared is not the opposite of being loved, and why Machiavelli's most misquoted line is the key to every relationship you have. 4. The specific behaviors that broadcast approval seeking to everyone watching you, and how to eliminate them. 5. How to rebuild your psychological architecture so that approval becomes irrelevant. Not something you suppress, but something you simply no longer need. Stay with this entire video, because the 5th point is where the real shift happens, and most men never get there. 1. Approval seeking is not weakness, it's surrender. Let's establish something immediately. When you need someone's approval, you are not being humble. You are not being considerate. You are not being emotionally intelligent. You are surrendering your authority. Here's what that means in practice. You have a decision to make, a real one. Maybe it's a business move. Maybe it's ending a relationship. Maybe it's changing careers, relocating, cutting someone off. You know what the right call is. You've known for weeks. But before you act, you go looking for permission. You frame it as asking for feedback. You call it checking in with people who know me. You tell yourself you're being thoughtful. You're not being thoughtful. You're stalling. You're searching for someone to tell you it's okay, so that if it goes wrong, the failure can be shared. That is surrender. Machiavelli observed this pattern in his analysis of leaders throughout the Prince and Discourses on Livy. He watched princes who were militarily capable, intellectually sharp, and politically positioned, men who had everything they needed to hold power, and he watched them collapse. Not because they were outmaneuvered, but because they needed the court to like them. They needed the approval of advisors, nobles, the public. And the moment that need became visible, those advisors stopped fearing them and started managing them. Real-world example. Think about a manager you've had in your life. Not the best one, the most common one. The one who called endless meetings before making a decision. The one who said, "I want to hear everyone's perspective," before any significant change. The one who, when someone complained, would immediately walk the decision back. You didn't respect that manager. Nobody did. Not because he was wrong about the decisions, but because the process of constantly seeking consensus told everyone in the room one thing: he doesn't trust himself. And here's the brutal truth about human nature. When you don't trust yourself, nobody else will either. Trust is not given because you ask for it. It is transferred from you to others when you demonstrate it first, internally. The man who requires approval is the man who has made the people around him his silent rulers. Machiavelli's word for this dynamic is virtù, Not virtue in the moral sense, but in the Roman sense, the capacity to act decisively with one's own power, in accordance with one's own judgment, regardless of circumstance. Virtue is incompatible with needing to be liked. One exists, the other doesn't. Now, here's where this gets personal. Because most men don't just seek approval from others, they seek it from themselves. And that internal approval seeking is even more destructive. Which brings us to point 2. How approval seeking destroys your ability to lead, starting with yourself. Leadership is not a title. Leadership is not a job description. Leadership is what happens when a situation needs a decision and you make one, cleanly, without hesitation, and without requiring the room to applaud you for it. Most men have never experienced that. And the reason is this: before they can lead anyone else, they have not learned to lead themselves. What does it mean to lead yourself? It means your internal voice, the one that evaluates your choices, does not sound like your father, does not sound like your ex, does not sound like the comment section. It sounds like you. Here's how approval seeking dismantles this. When you grow up in environments where approval was conditional, where love was tied to performance, where affection was the reward for compliance, you develop a psychological reflex. Before any significant action, you run an internal simulation. What will they think? Not is this right? Not does this align with where I'm going? What will they think? That question is a cage, and most men live their entire lives inside it. Machiavelli writes in The Prince, chapter 17, about the ruler who attempts to satisfy everyone. He notes that such a ruler is perpetually vulnerable, because those whose approval you need become the architects of your decisions, and you become the executor of their preferences, not your own. Think about Steve Jobs, not the hagiographic version, the actual version, the man who fired people without apology, who killed products that teams had spent years building, who famously didn't take polls about what customers wanted. He observed what they needed and built it. Jobs was not popular inside Apple during his early years there. He was feared, sometimes despised. People cried in his presence. They called him brutal. And yet, the company he built became the most valuable in human history. Now compare that to almost every major corporate failure you've read about in the last 20 years. What do they have in common? Leadership by committee, decisions made by consensus, executives who needed the board, the press, and the shareholders to like them before they acted. The approval-seeking leader doesn't just fail. He fails slowly, publicly, and with maximum collateral damage. Because instead of making one wrong decision quickly, which can be corrected, he makes 1,000 small compromises, each one invisible, each one carving away at his authority until there is nothing left to lead. You are either the author of your decisions or the audience for them. There is no third option. This is where Machiavelli's most misunderstood idea comes in. Most people think they understand the line about being feared versus loved. They're wrong. Here's what he actually meant, and why it reframes every relationship in your life. 3. The feared vs. loved question, Machiavelli's most misread line. Here is the most famous line in The Prince. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Most men read that and think, be cold, be hard, don't let anyone in. That is the wrong reading. That reading has destroyed more men than it has built. Here is what Machiavelli actually means. He is not talking about choosing between fear and love as personality traits. He is talking about reliability. Love, he observes, is conditional. It exists as long as you satisfy the person who offers it. The moment you stop serving their needs, the moment you make a decision they don't like, love evaporates, and they act against you. Fear, properly understood, is consistent. Not the fear of violence or cruelty. Machiavelli is explicit that cruelty for its own sake destroys a prince. He means the fear of consequence. The understanding that you are not a person who can be manipulated, managed or ignored without cost. That is not the same as being cold. That is called integrity with teeth. It means when you say something, it happens. When you set a boundary, it holds. When you make a decision, it stands, regardless of who pushes back. The man who operates this way is not feared in the way a tyrant is feared. He is respected in the way a force of nature is respected. You don't negotiate with gravity, you account for it. Think about a father, a real one, not the one who tries to be his kid's best friend, the one who his children might be frustrated with as teenagers, might resent at times, but who, 20 years later, his children call when their world falls apart. Not because he was always warm, because he was always there, because his word meant something, because his standards never moved. That man was not always loved in the immediate sense, but he was trusted in the deepest sense. Now think about the opposite, the father who needed his kids to like him, who never said no, who adjusted every standard based on how upset his children became, who needed to be the cool dad. His children didn't respect him, and deep down, they knew it. And that became their template for authority. They grew up believing all authority was negotiable, that any boundary would bend under enough pressure. That is the inheritance of approval seeking. Machiavelli's point is not be cruel. His point is, be consistent. Be a person whose character doesn't change based on who's watching or who's complaining. That kind of man is not feared in the sense of terror. He is feared in the sense that people understand there are real consequences to crossing him. And that understanding creates something approval never can: genuine respect. Now, knowing this is one thing. Executing it is another. Because approval seeking doesn't announce itself. It hides in your body language, your speech patterns, your micro-behaviors. Point 4 is about identifying exactly what you're broadcasting and how to stop. 4. The behaviors that broadcast approval seeking and how to eliminate them. Here is the uncomfortable part. You do not need to announce that you need approval. Your behavior does it for you. And the people in your life, especially the ones who want leverage over you, they're reading it constantly. Here are the most common broadcasts. The first broadcast, over-explaining. You make a decision, someone questions it, and instead of holding your position, you launch into a 3-minute justification. Why? Because you need them to understand. You need them to agree. You need them to validate that your reasoning was sound. The irony, the more you explain, the weaker your position looks. Every additional sentence says, I'm not sure you'll accept this, so I need to convince you. A man who is certain doesn't explain himself to people who don't matter. He says what he means, once, and moves. The second broadcast, apology creep. This is the habit of apologizing not for actual wrongs, but for existing. Sorry to bother you, but I might be wrong about this, but this is probably a dumb question, but these phrases are not politeness. They are preemptive surrender. You are apologizing for your perspective before you've even stated it. Eliminate them. Not from discipline, from realization. Your perspective does not require a disclaimer. Your question does not require an apology. You are not an inconvenience. Stop acting like one. The third broadcast, laugh checking. You say something. Then you immediately look at the room to see if they laughed, smiled, or reacted positively. This is one of the most visible tells of an approval seeker. It says, I am not confident in what I just said. Please confirm it was acceptable. Comedians know this. The moment a performer looks to the audience for permission, the audience stops believing in them. Confidence is contagious. So is the lack of it. The fourth broadcast, chameleon positioning. You are with your gym friends, and you are one person. You are with your family, and you are someone else. You are with your boss, and you become almost unrecognizable. This is not adaptability. Adaptability is adjusting your communication style. Chameleon positioning is adjusting your values and positions based on who's in the room. Machiavelli warns explicitly against the prince who changes his character to please different factions. He calls this the surest path to being trusted by no one, because eventually every faction sees you around the others. Be the same man in every room. Your tone can shift. Your core doesn't. The fifth broadcast: delayed decisions. You have the information. You have the authority. You have the position. And you wait. Not because you're gathering more data, but because as long as you haven't decided, no one can criticize you for the decision. Machiavelli writes that indecision is not neutrality. It is the choice to let circumstances decide for you. And circumstances are a brutal, indifferent decision-maker. Make the call. Make it wrong sometimes. Correct it. Move. The man who decides, even imperfectly, builds judgment. The man who waits for consensus builds nothing. Now, identifying these behaviors is step one. But here's the thing. Most men try to suppress approval seeking through willpower alone. That doesn't work, because approval seeking is not a habit. It's an architecture. And you don't renovate a building by rearranging the furniture. Point 5 is about rebuilding from the foundation. 5. Rebuilding your psychological architecture, making approval irrelevant. Everything up to this point has been diagnosis. This is the prescription. Understand something first. You are not broken. The need for approval is not a character flaw. It is a learned survival mechanism. At some point in your life, probably early, you discovered that approval meant safety. Disapproval meant danger. Emotional danger, social danger, sometimes physical danger. Your nervous system learned, get approved, avoid rejection, adjust accordingly. That system kept you safe then. It is destroying you now. So the work is not to shame yourself for the reflex. The work is to build a new one. Here is how that happens, in 3 stages. Stage 1. Establish an internal authority. Right now, when you make a decision, whose voice are you consulting first? For most men, the honest answer is not their own. The first stage of rebuilding is establishing yourself as your primary court of appeal. This means, before you speak to anyone about a decision, you sit with your own judgment first. Not forever, not in isolation, but first. Ask yourself, what do I actually think? What do I actually know? What decision would I make if no one would ever know about it and no one could praise or blame me for it? That answer, the one that comes when the audience disappears, that is your actual compass. Start trusting it, even when it's inconvenient, especially then. Machiavelli's counsel to the prince on advisors is precise. Surround yourself with honest counsel, but let it be known that honest counsel is asked for, not given voluntarily by those seeking to influence you. The prince who solicits opinions becomes dependent on them. The prince who invites them maintains sovereignty over the final decision. You can listen to everyone. Just make sure you're the last vote. Stage 2. Build a results-based identity. The approval seeker's identity is built on perception, on how others see him, on the labels others give him: reliable, smart, a good guy, a hard worker. The problem with a perception-based identity is that perception changes. Someone gets jealous. Someone misreads a situation. Someone leaves. And suddenly, the identity collapses. A results-based identity is built differently. You set a standard. You meet it, or you don't, and you deal with the outcome. Over time, you build a record with yourself, not with the world. With yourself. I said I would wake up at 5 a.m. for 30 days. I did it. I said I would not contact her after the breakup. I didn't. I said I would finish this project without asking for validation at every stage. I finished it. These are not achievements you post. They are contracts you keep, internally. Over time, this record becomes your foundation. And here is the critical shift. When your identity rests on your record with yourself rather than others' perception of you, disapproval loses its power. Because disapproval doesn't change your record. It doesn't alter what you've done or who you've become. Someone's opinion of you becomes data, occasionally useful, mostly irrelevant, instead of a verdict. Stage 3. Calibrate your circle ruthlessly. This is the part most men skip because it requires the most discomfort. Your current environment is either building your independence or it is feeding your approval seeking. The people who respond to your growing decisiveness with discomfort, who preferred you uncertain and agreeable, those people are not your allies. They have been benefiting from your need for approval. Your growth disrupts their power over you. Machiavelli is blunt on this. The prince who rises must expect resistance most violently from those who benefited from the previous arrangement. Some people in your life have built entire relationships on the version of you that needed their approval. They liked being needed. They liked being your validator. When you stop seeking their input, when you become harder to manage, they will call it arrogance. They will say you've changed. They will say you've become cold. What they are saying underneath the language is, you are no longer controllable. That is not a criticism. That is confirmation you're on the right path. Calibrate accordingly. This does not mean become cold or isolate yourself. It means become selective. Invest in people who challenge your thinking without requiring your compliance. People who respect your decisions even when they disagree. People whose presence makes you sharper, not smaller. The quality of your inner circle determines the ceiling of your growth. Every man who has ever done anything significant has, at some point, outgrown a circle and had the courage to move forward anyway. Here is the complete picture. Most men move through their entire lives quietly, negotiating their identity with the people around them, adjusting, softening, shrinking. Not because they're weak, but because no one ever showed them that there was another way. Machiavelli showed them another way 500 years ago. He said, "The man who depends on others for his security will always be insecure. The man who builds his foundation internally, in his own judgment, his own record, his own standards, becomes almost impossible to manipulate. Not because he's guarded, but because the lever is gone. The lever was your approval seeking. Remove it, and you remove the mechanism through which others control you." This is what Machiavelli called fortezza, inner fortification. Not walls around your emotions, not emotional suppression. A core so solid that the opinions of others orbit it rather than constitute it. Here is what that looks like in practice. You make a decision, people push back, and you feel it, the old pull, the old reflex. Maybe I should reconsider. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm wrong. And instead of acting on that reflex, you pause, you evaluate, not whether they like it, whether it's correct. If they have new information that changes the picture, you update. That's intelligence. If they simply dislike the outcome, you hold. That's authority. The difference between those two responses is the difference between a leader and a follower wearing a leader's clothes. You know which one you are. You've always known. The question is whether you're willing to stop performing the version of yourself designed to make others comfortable and start being the version of yourself you actually respect. That's Machiavelli's real test. Not a test of ruthlessness, not a test of cruelty. A test of whether you trust yourself enough to stop asking for permission. If this hit you somewhere specific, if there was a moment in this video where you thought that's me, don't let that recognition go to waste. Awareness without action is just sophisticated self-deception. Here's what I want you to do right now, today, before this tab closes. 1. Identify one decision you've been delaying because you're waiting for approval. Make it. Today. Without polling anyone. 2. Identify one person in your life whose opinion carries more weight than your own judgment. Ask yourself why, then start the process of rebalancing that. 3. Write down 3 things you've done in the last 30 days that you're proud of, that no one knows about. If you can't think of 3, that tells you something important. If you want to go deeper on Machiavellian strategy, power psychology, and the philosophy of self-mastery, subscribe. We cover one framework at a time. No motivation speeches, no empty hype. Just the uncomfortable truth, delivered clearly, every week. Drop a comment below with the one approval behavior from point 4 that you recognize most in yourself. Not to confess, to commit. Awareness, named publicly, has power. Use it.